When Shedeur Sanders quietly trimmed a 40-minute timeline down to a sharp 15, almost no one talked about the decision itself. They talked about where he was, what he was wearing, who he was laughing with. That detail should tell you everything, because in a league that claims to obsess over processing speed, composure, and decision-making under pressure, the actual skill on display somehow became invisible the moment it arrived wrapped in ease. What should have been read as control was immediately labeled distraction, and that disconnect is the real story. This wasn't a mistake, it wasn't carelessness, it wasn't someone losing focus at the wrong time. It was a moment that exposed how differently the same behavior is judged depending on who's doing it and how comfortable they look doing it. Shedeur didn't rush, he didn't over-explain, he didn't posture. He made a clean choice, edited with intention, and moved on. That calm efficiency is exactly what decision-makers say they want from a quarterback, but when it showed up paired with laughter, fashion, and confidence, the reaction flipped. Admiration turned into suspicion almost instantly. That's how you know something deeper got touched, because outrage doesn't come from irrelevance, it comes from disruption. And this moment disrupted more than expectations around off-season behavior. It unsettled an unspoken belief about what leadership is supposed to look like, how it's supposed to sound, and who is allowed to carry it with warmth instead of stiffness. The video wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it didn't beg for attention, yet it pulled one anyway, because it refused to perform anxiety for approval. What a lot of people missed is that nothing about this was random. The pacing, the cuts, the tone, the confidence to leave things out instead of shoving everything in. That's not laziness, that's discipline. In football terms, that's reading the field, eliminating noise, and committing to the best option without hesitation. The irony is heavy. Traits scouts spend years hunting for showed up casually in a format they didn't respect, so instead of credit, it triggered discomfort. And then came the commentary. Words like unserious, distracting, and bad optics floated around, as if they were objective critiques rather than emotional reactions. But notice what those words avoid talking about. They don't address performance, they don't question intelligence, they don't point to preparation gaps. They circle something harder to say out loud: comfort, ease, joy. For some viewers, especially in spaces that still confuse professionalism with tension, seeing a young quarterback this unbothered felt wrong. That's why this moment keeps getting misread, because it's easier to critique surface details than to confront why certain expressions of confidence feel threatening. This wasn't a player losing the plot, this was someone refusing to shrink himself to fit a mold that no longer makes sense. Through a simple vlog, the script flipped. Instead of asking whether Shedeur is ready for the league, the moment quietly forced a different question into the room. Is the league ready for someone like him to lead without pretending to be someone else? And that's where the real tension begins. Not with fashion, not with travel, not with editing, but with what happens when control doesn't look stressed, when leadership doesn't announce itself loudly, and when composure shows up smiling instead of scowling. This wasn't just content, it was a mirror. And a lot of people didn't like what it reflected. On the surface, there was nothing about the vlog that should have caused a reaction at all. Off-season footage like this exists everywhere now. Players travel, they document, they show personality. The league even encourages it, at least in theory. But the difference here was timing, tone, and who was holding the camera. When Shedeur Sanders uploaded a relaxed, tightly edited glimpse into a Paris trip, it landed in the middle of an evaluation-heavy moment where every movement gets overanalyzed. That alone was enough to turn something ordinary into a provocation. The content itself was almost aggressively normal. No grandstanding, no hype speeches, no forced branding. Just movement through a foreign city, casual conversations, easy humor, and a clear sense of self. Yet that normalcy is exactly what made it combustible. Because for certain audiences, quarterbacks aren't supposed to look comfortable in unfamiliar spaces. They're supposed to look locked in, visibly burdened by expectation, always signaling seriousness. When Shedeur didn't perform that stress, people filled in the gap with suspicion. Context matters here. The off-season is when narratives are built as much as rosters. Silence is often interpreted as discipline. Visibility gets mistaken for distraction. So when a quarterback shows control over his image instead of hiding from it, the reaction isn't neutral, it's evaluative. Suddenly, the vlog wasn't just a vlog, it was treated like a statement, even though nothing was explicitly declared. That's how flashpoints form, not from what's said, but from what people project onto it. There's also a double expectation at work. Fans and analysts claim to want authenticity, but only within boundaries. Be real, but not too visible. Show personality, but don't let it lead the frame. Enjoy your life, but not in a way that looks effortless. Shedeur's vlog ignored those invisible guardrails. It wasn't defensive, it didn't justify its existence, it simply existed, and that lack of apology disrupted the usual power dynamic between athlete and audience. What pushed it over the edge was how quickly the discourse shifted away from football entirely. Instead of asking what this showed about decision-making or mental processing, the conversation swerved toward optics and image control. That shift reveals the real issue. When people can't critique production quality, preparation, or clarity, they default to questioning intent. And once intent is questioned, narratives harden fast. A calm, creative choice becomes framed as arrogance. Confidence gets confused with entitlement. And yet, the reaction said more about the environment than the video ever could. A simple piece of content became a flashpoint because it forced an uncomfortable contrast. On one side, a young quarterback moving freely, self-directed, visibly at ease. On the other, a system still more comfortable when leadership looks tense and tightly managed. The clash wasn't accidental, it was inevitable, because when visibility meets outdated expectations, even the simplest moment can explode into something much bigger than it was ever meant to be. There has always been a silent checklist attached to the quarterback position, one that rarely gets written down but is enforced all the same. Be poised, be confident, lead the room, but just as important, don't do too much. Don't draw unnecessary attention. Don't look like you're enjoying the spotlight. For decades, quarterbacks have been praised not just for how they play, but for how neatly they fit into this invisible mold. And when Shedeur Sanders stepped outside of it without hesitation, the discomfort was immediate. These expectations aren't announced in press conferences. They're implied through tone, framing, and who gets described as focused versus flashy. A quarterback is allowed to be expressive as long as that expression feels muted, familiar, and non-threatening. Seriousness becomes a costume, and deviation from it gets interpreted as immaturity rather than individuality. The irony is that the league markets stars, but still clings to an image of leadership rooted in restraint, especially off the field. For black quarterbacks, those boundaries have always been tighter. Leadership has been historically coded through a narrow lens, where calm meant quiet and authority meant emotional distance. Any display of warmth, humor, or cultural expression risks being misread as a lack of discipline. So when Shedeur moved comfortably through a global city, joking, observing, deciding, and editing with clarity, it didn't register as composure for everyone. For some, it registered as a violation. This is where the unspoken rules start doing real damage. They turn neutral behavior into a test. They force players to perform seriousness instead of embodying it. A quarterback becomes judged not by how he processes information, but by how convincingly he can signal conformity. And the signal most people expect is tension. Look stressed enough and you're locked in. Look relaxed and suddenly questions appear. What makes these rules so powerful is how rarely they get challenged head-on. They're enforced through commentary, draft narratives, and coded language. Not a distraction becomes high praise. Coach's kid gets used as reassurance, as if competence needs to be validated through proximity to tradition rather than evidence of skill. So when Shedeur bypassed that ritual entirely, it unsettled the script. He didn't seek approval. He didn't adjust his tone. He didn't soften his presence. And that's the part many people couldn't sit with.
because the unspoken rules only work when everyone agrees to play along. They collapse the moment someone proves leadership doesn't have to look stiff to be real. The vlog didn't break these rules with rebellion, it broke them by indifference. It treated joy, clarity, and control as defaults rather than risks. And in a system that still confuses conformity with readiness, that kind of ease feels like a challenge, even when none was intended. There's a specific kind of intelligence football culture claims to value above all else: processing speed, decision-making under pressure, the ability to absorb chaos and still choose cleanly. But what people rarely admit is how uncomfortable they get when that intelligence shows up outside of the usual testing grounds, when it doesn't arrive wrapped in film room language or shouted through buzzwords. When Shedeur Sanders demonstrated that kind of cognition through something as unassuming as editing a vlog, many didn't recognize it for what it was. Cutting 40 minutes down to 15 isn't just trimming for content, it's prioritization, it's pattern recognition, it's knowing what matters and discarding what doesn't without second-guessing. That's the same mental skill set quarterbacks use when a pocket collapses. You don't process everything, you eliminate. You trust your read, you move forward. The fact that this happened off the field in a creative setting made it easy for critics to dismiss, but that dismissal says more about their limits than his. This is the kind of intelligence football culture claims to value above all else: processing speed, decision-making under pressure, the ability to absorb chaos and still choose cleanly. But what people rarely admit is how uncomfortable they get when that intelligence shows up outside of the usual testing grounds, when it doesn't arrive wrapped in film room language or shouted through buzzwords. When Shedeur Sanders demonstrated that kind of cognition through something as unassuming as editing a vlog, many didn't recognize it for what it was. Cutting 40 minutes down to 15 isn't just trimming for content, it's prioritization, it's pattern recognition, it's knowing what matters and discarding what doesn't without second-guessing. That's the same mental skill set quarterbacks use when a pocket collapses. You don't process everything, you eliminate. You trust your read, you move forward. The fact that this happened off the field in a creative setting made it easy for critics to dismiss, but that dismissal says more about their limits than his. This is the kind of intelligence football culture claims to value above all else: processing speed, decision-making under pressure, the ability to absorb chaos and still choose cleanly. But what people rarely admit is how uncomfortable they get when that intelligence shows up outside of the usual testing grounds, when it doesn't arrive wrapped in film room language or shouted through buzzwords. When Shedeur Sanders demonstrated that kind of cognition through something as unassuming as editing a vlog, many didn't recognize it for what it was. Cutting 40 minutes down to 15 isn't just trimming for content, it's prioritization, it's pattern recognition, it's knowing what matters and discarding what doesn't without second-guessing. That's the same mental skill set quarterbacks use when a pocket collapses. You don't process everything, you eliminate. You trust your read, you move forward. The fact that this happened off the field in a creative setting made it easy for critics to dismiss, but that dismissal says more about their limits than his.
This is where the misinterpretation becomes costly. When intelligence doesn't match the traditional visuals, it gets downgraded. People start looking for flaws instead of understanding the skill on display. Editing becomes content creation. Cultural awareness becomes branding. Social ease becomes distraction. Each reframe strips value from something that, in practice, helps quarterbacks adapt faster and lead more effectively. Shedeur didn't explain his decisions because people who trust their processing rarely do. They don't narrate every choice, they just execute. That lack of exposition frustrates systems built on constant reassurance. But the truth is, the ability to move cleanly without explanation is a form of mastery. And when you recognize it, the vlog stops looking like a side project. It starts looking like a quiet demonstration of how his mind works when no one is calling the plays for him. What grounded the entire moment wasn't just confidence, it was connection. Shedeur Sanders didn't move through that space alone, and that detail matters more than most people realized. With Shilo alongside him, behind the camera and within the conversation, the vlog carried a different kind of energy. Not performative, not defensive, stable. And stability is one of the most overlooked ingredients in elite leadership.
The dynamic between the two brothers wasn't polished for optics. It was casual, honest, and rhythm-based. Teasing without malice, pushback without ego. You could see how quickly they adjusted to each other in real time. That kind of interaction reveals emotional security. There's no need to dominate the moment or control the narrative when trust is already established. In a league that often celebrates lone wolf leadership, this was something else entirely. Sports culture loves to frame brotherhood as rivalry. One rises, the other competes. One leads, the other fades. But what played out here was collaborative presence. Shilo wasn't just documenting, he was shaping the space. Shedeur wasn't posturing, he was responding. No one was scrambling for control. That balance doesn't just happen, it's built over time, through shared experience and mutual respect. And it creates an environment where clarity thrives. For quarterbacks, that kind of relational grounding is not a bonus, it's a weapon. The ability to stay composed externally is often rooted in internal safety. When you're not preoccupied with proving yourself to the people closest to you, your mental bandwidth stays open. You make cleaner reads, you adapt without panic. You don't mistake noise for urgency. The calm people noticed in the vlog wasn't situational, it was relational. What makes this dynamic even more important is how rarely it's celebrated at the professional level. Emotional support systems are often kept invisible, treated as private or irrelevant, but they shape how athletes handle pressure more than any drill. Seeing Shedeur move with that kind of support in a high-profile space disrupted another expectation. Leadership wasn't isolated, confidence wasn't lonely, and success didn't require separation from the people who know you best. That's why this section of the story matters, because the vlog wasn't just about where they were or what they wore, it was about how they moved together. And that quiet collaboration revealed something deeper than bravado ever could. It showed what leadership looks like when it's reinforced instead of performed, when stability isn't borrowed from status but built through relationship. And that kind of foundation doesn't crumble when the spotlight gets hotter. It's impossible to understand the confidence on display without acknowledging where it was built, but it's just as important not to turn that foundation into a legend that misses the point. Deion Sanders didn't manufacture personalities or script outcomes. What he put in place was a framework.
One centered on clarity, self-trust, and the idea that identity is not something you negotiate away for acceptance. That distinction matters, especially when people rush to reduce everything to genetics or fame. The blueprint wasn't about shielding his sons from pressure, it was about normalizing it. Instead of teaching them to shrink under scrutiny, he taught them to understand it. Instead of framing attention as a threat, he treated it as a tool. That's why moments like the Paris vlog don't feel performative, they feel familiar. When you're raised in an environment where presence is practiced early, you don't tense up when the room gets bigger. What often gets lost in the public conversation is discipline. There's a tendency to assume that freedom and structure are opposites, when in reality they work best together. The Sanders household didn't promote expression without accountability. It emphasized preparation before visibility, substance before style, confidence before applause. That's why the ease looks earned rather than reckless. The work happens quietly, long before anyone sees the results. This approach also explains why Shedeur doesn't rush to clarify himself. He wasn't taught to outsource his self-worth to outside validation. When you grow up with consistent expectations and honest feedback, you don't need to constantly prove seriousness. You simply operate. That's not arrogance, that's internal alignment. And internal alignment is what allows leaders to stay steady when the noise spikes. Avoiding mythologizing matters here, because the lesson isn't that Deion created something extraordinary out of thin air, it's that he resisted something common. He resisted the idea that success requires emotional flattening. He rejected the notion that leadership has to come packaged in stiffness. Instead, he modeled a version of authority that leaves room for humor, self-expression, and humanity without losing control. That influence shows up not in speeches or slogans, but in how Shedeur moves.
in the absence of panic, in the refusal to overcorrect, in the confidence to let moments stand without explanation. The blueprint isn't flashy, but it's durable, and it produces leaders who don't need permission to be themselves, even when the stage gets bigger than anyone expected. The intensity of the backlash wasn't proportionate to the content, and that alone is revealing. A short, relaxed vlog doesn't normally ignite hours of commentary or heated debate, but in this case, it did, because it poked at something far more sensitive than fashion or travel. Shedeur Sanders wasn't just visible, he was visibly in control of his own narrative, and that made certain corners of the football world uneasy. A lot of the criticism came wrapped in familiar language. Words like distraction, focus, and timing surfaced quickly, presented as professional concern. But those critiques rarely pointed to anything concrete. There were no missed workouts cited, no preparation lapses identified, no on-field issues tied directly to the video, which is why many fans have pointed out that the pushback seemed less about performance and more about permission, about who gets to decide when an athlete's visibility becomes acceptable. To be clear, much of what followed lives in the space of perception and speculation. Some observers have suggested that teams and media outlets are still uncomfortable with quarterbacks who don't conform neatly to traditional image control. Others argued the reaction exposed anxiety about athletes managing their own platforms without filtering everything through league-approved channels. These aren't verified claims, but they reflect a broader conversation that's been building for years, and this moment simply brought it into focus. There's also a pattern in how confidence gets rebranded when it can't be moderated. When an athlete doesn't over-explain himself or soften his presence, critics often reach for character labels instead of analysis. Relaxed becomes careless. Self-assured becomes entitled. Joy gets mistaken for a lack of seriousness. Those labels travel fast because they rely on emotion, not evidence. They turn discomfort into critique. Race and expectation are impossible to separate from this conversation. The league has a long history of praising autonomy in some quarterbacks while trading the same behavior as a red flag in others. That doesn't require a coordinated effort or malicious intent. Cultural bias often works through habit rather than hostility. When leadership doesn't match the familiar template, it gets flagged as risky, even when the results don't justify the concern. And that's why the pushback felt so loud. It wasn't trying to correct behavior, it was trying to restore control. The moment a quarterback proves he can be publicly present, culturally fluent, and internally grounded without asking for approval, the old levers stop working. You can't scare him into silence or shame him into shrinking, so the noise increases, not because something went wrong, but because something shifted. In the end, the intensity wasn't about a vlog breaking rules, it was about exposing how fragile some of those rules actually are. When they're challenged by someone moving with clarity instead of chaos, the reaction tends to spike. Not because the behavior is dangerous, but because it's hard to contain. What made this moment feel unavoidable rather than controversial is that it landed right on a generational fault line the league can no longer paper over. The NFL was built on controlled messaging, polished answers, and a clear separation between who you are on the field and who you're allowed to be everywhere else. But players coming up now don't recognize that split as natural. To them, authenticity isn't reckless, it's efficient. And when Shedeur Sanders moved freely across platforms, cultures, and conversations without changing his tone, it highlighted a shift that had already started long before that vlog ever went live. Younger athletes grew up documenting their lives in real time. They learned how to read audiences, manage energy, and shape narratives before they ever entered a locker room. That doesn't make them unserious, it makes them literate in a world where visibility is unavoidable. The old model treated exposure as something to survive. The new one treats it as something to master. And once you see that difference, it's impossible to unsee why this transition feels so jarring to established power structures. This isn't about rebellion against the league, it's about a mismatch in assumptions. The previous generation was taught that humility meant disappearing off the field and speaking only when prompted. The current one understands that silence doesn't equal focus and that personality doesn't dilute performance. They've watched influence, branding, and leadership converge across every other industry, and they're not interested in pretending football exists outside of that reality. That's why attempts to frame moments like this as a phase fall flat. Phases fade, structural changes don't. The audience has already moved. Fans want to understand who players are, not just how they throw. They're drawn to transparency, cultural fluency, and emotional intelligence because those
traits mirror their own lives, and players who can meet that energy without fracturing themselves gain something previous generations never had: alignment between performance and presence. The league can slow this shift, but it can't stop it. Once quarterbacks prove they can lead, prepare, and perform while being fully visible, the argument against that visibility collapses. The question stops being whether this approach is acceptable and becomes whether resisting it makes sense at all. Because clinging to outdated optics doesn't preserve order, it creates distance between the game and the people watching it. What this moment signaled wasn't defiance, it was inevitability. A new template is forming in real time, one where leadership isn't muted to appear credible, and professionalism doesn't require emotional flattening. The NFL can either adapt to that reality or keep reacting to it after the fact. But the direction is already set. The generation coming up isn't asking for permission to be whole, they're already operating that way. By the time the noise started to settle, one thing was already clear. This was never about travel footage or outfits or a few minutes of edited video. The reaction only felt disproportionate because the moment itself forced a reckoning. What looked small on the surface cracked open a much bigger conversation about power, identity, and who gets to lead without constantly proving they belong. When Shedeur Sanders pressed upload, he didn't challenge the system directly, he simply moved through it as himself, and that was enough. The vlog worked as a mirror. It reflected how quickly comfort gets misread as complacency and how confidence still unsettles spaces that claim to value it. There was no speech, no manifesto, just clarity, pacing, humor, and presence. Yet that combination turned into a cultural fault line because it exposed how tightly leadership has been defined for so long. When someone shows that those definitions aren't fixed, the illusion of control starts to slip. This moment also shifted the question everyone had been asking. It stopped being about whether Shedeur is ready for the league. It became about whether the league is ready for leaders who don't separate performance from personality. The old era demanded silence to signal seriousness. The emerging one understands that seriousness shows up in preparation, not in how small you make yourself. That shift can feel threatening if you're still measuring readiness by outdated optics. What makes this so important is that it isn't isolated. It's not a one-off clip or a viral detour. It's part of a larger evolution in how athletes understand their role in the world. They're not just players anymore. They're communicators, cultural participants, decision-makers in public view. And the ones who navigate that space with control instead of fear are showing a new kind of readiness, one that doesn't fit neatly into old scouting reports. The most telling part is how unbothered it all was. No scrambling to clarify, no rushed apologies, no attempt to soften the moment for approval. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was the product of alignment, of knowing who you are before the reaction ever arrives. And that kind of certainty is hard to rattle, no matter how loud the commentary gets. So if this made people uncomfortable, that discomfort is worth sitting with. Because what's ending isn't professionalism or focus. It's the idea that leadership has to look stiff to be credible and quiet to be respected. What's rising in its place is something more durable. Charisma backed by preparation, confidence rooted in culture, presence that doesn't ask permission. This wasn't just a vlog, it was a preview, a signal that the next era of quarterbacks won't be edited into submission or molded into silence.
They'll lead out loud, move with ease, and let their preparation speak for itself. And whether the system adjusts willingly or not, that future is already walking through the door.